We're finishing with a really interesting conversation. I think you'll find. What do you do when you buy a security if you're not going to sell it? You lend or borrow it, and you have the whole world of collateralization. The world of crypto has revolutionized lending and borrowing through DeFi. For the last session, I'm going to have a chat. We have very happy to have with us Stani Kulechov, who's the founder and CEO of Aave. So Aave have been a leading light in the world of DeFi. I'll invite Stani up and we'll have a discussion. Thank you. Hi, Stani. So we caught. I know tomorrow. I bet you're going to be quite tied up with Token 2049 and all the crypto crowd. But DeFi, I guess, is what financial services used to call sec lending in some way. But first of all, tell us about your journey, how Aave came about, and just how you got to this point.
Yeah, Aave's story is quite interesting. So I've been living and growing up with technology and building a lot of web applications. And at some point, my early 20s, I got into fintech and started to build fintech applications, mainly trying to figure out how to solve working capital finance for all the app developers that are publishing in App Store and Google Play and a bunch of other online platforms. And after a few of the experimentations, I got more excited about the regulatory part of finance and went to law school in Helsinki, Finland, where I'm originating from. And I think at some later stage of my studies, I started to get more excited about blockchain, and especially because I was reading a lot about Ethereum and the idea of smart contracts, and that you have this kind of like a computer running in a blockchain, and you can create different kinds of programs. And another part of it was the immutability. So when you created a program and you deployed it into the blockchain network, it basically was, you couldn't change it arbitrarily by yourself, and that created this idea of like trustless or trust minimized environment. Yeah, and then I basically, well, because I was a finance geek, I wanted to build something on chain that would relate to finance. And obviously, because of the blockchain narrative and the background, finance was one of the first use cases as well. So I started to look kind of like into traditional finance and different instrument that there was, like securities lending, securities borrowing, and created kind of like a first, I would say like a peer-to-peer order matching marketplace where you can use cryptographic assets as a collateral and borrow liquidity against, and also supply liquidity and earn on your yield. And this was in 2016-17 when there wasn't any so-called stable coins in the Ethereum ecosystem. So everything was pretty early, and building these applications was really, really painful. But now happy to see that the whole space has been growing quite a lot.
And so Aave, so where is how have you got to now in terms of progress and volumes and all of this good stuff?
Progress has been very good. I think, especially for the past couple of years. So if you look for example, how the Aave protocol works, effectively you supply cryptographic assets and you earn interest there, and you can use those assets as a collateral to borrow other assets. So we kind of like combined the sec lending, sec borrowing, and deposit accounts together. And the reason for that is that on an on-chain ecosystem, you can actually get a lot of benefits when you kind of like can pool the liquidity. Since now a couple of years, the Aave protocol itself, so it's a smart contract-based protocol. It's been deployed on Ethereum and a few other blockchain networks such as Polygon and so-called layer 2s that are inheriting security from the Ethereum network, Arbitrum, and also Optimism and Avalanche, as well as another network. So it's kind of like a cross-chain protocol that is governed by the community, meaning that the Aave team itself can't change the rules of the protocol, but it has a formal process of how those different kinds of risk parameters can be altered. Currently, the protocol across all the networks is roughly securing from 5 to 15 billion worth of value assets, which is quite decent amount given the space is 100 billion worth of value, which is very small compared to the whole like finance space.
Yeah, so far, yeah. So and now you have Aave Arc, right, which is on the institutional side of DeFi. So tell me about Aave Arc and how does that differ and what's the objectives there?
Yeah, so I think one of the benefits of decentralized finance has been that it kind of created this like a global or like maybe the right word is like a permissionless market for liquidity in specific rules. So where you don't need to necessarily trust the counterparties. So you have smart contracts which will execute whatever happens between those counterparties. And at the same time, you can access these protocols without actually giving up your custody unless you really want that as a service. And that means that you could actually retain the security of your assets to yourself and to your institution. So, and because DeFi is kind of like built on a public blockchain, something that it created, something that's been a very big benefit is the transparency. Now, with many of the funds that are participating in decentralized finance, or I would say even like want to participate, they might not have the ability to do so because there is a lot of regulatory unclarity at the moment. So like where decentralized finance, for example, stands for at the moment. And what we created together with the Fireblocks team is a separate Aave market where you have this whitelister functionality that actually can whitelist depositors, borrowers, and so-called liquidators that are keeping the network solvent when they go through a common KYC process. And down the line, you can add more whitelisters into the ecosystem. And there's Swiss Figma regulated bank SIBA that is added as a whitelister as well. So effectively, the key difference here is that in Aave Arc, you can use smart contracts, you have transparency, and you can access in a non-custodial way into this market. So you get all the DeFi benefits without kind of like by still knowing your counterparties. And sometimes people ask me like why you need something like Aave Arc besides of the fact that there's maybe still kind of like a room before institutions are looking more into decentralized finance. Is because in crypto we have a lot of centralized service providers that operate in a more like a black box model, such as we saw with Celsius and BlockFi, and you couldn't really understand where the yields were coming from because you didn't have that transparency, and also you gave up the custody for your assets. So it was a good example why something like smart contract-based protocols could actually solve this kind of like things and bring more transparency into the wider crypto space.
Very good. And if we're talking about DeFi, right? So you have the crypto world teaching TradFi, traditional finance, a thing or two about the possibility of like real-time updates of record of ownership, real-time settlement, the ability to do automated lending and borrowing, etc. And then sometimes the crypto environment's learning some things from traditional finance, like effective risk management and things like this. So we're talking about DeFi. We have to talk about the fact that the world blew up a little bit with, on the risk management side, things not being sufficiently over-collateralized, etc. What are your thoughts about that? Do you call that growing pains? And what are the lessons being learned in the DeFi community about how all of this should progress?
Yeah, I think like basically there's two types of blowouts in the recently. One was the centralized lending platforms that are basically over leveraging themselves, and there wasn't really visibility on what they were doing, and that's kind of like that's been very challenging for the whole space and in general and for financial ecosystem. But the second one is with the Terra Luna example, where they were building a stablecoin that used smart contracts, and they had their own blockchain, and you could see it as an aspect of decentralized finance. But the kind of like issue with their model was that it was poorly financially engineered. So the economics and the mathematics didn't work behind of that protocol, effectively leaving it completely under-collateralized. And it's kind of interesting because like decentralized finance is an amazing space where any developer, any part of the world can actually come and contribute and build something very uniquely amazing. So I started the Aave protocol pretty much from my university dorm room back in 2016. So it really creates access to develop financial infrastructure and innovate, and also access to users globally to basically access the liquidity. But at the same time, when you have an open ecosystem, it also means that everything isn't equal in decentralized finance, and some of the projects they build protocols for larger scale. So the same way as we are using any other tech today, like the IP protocol or HTTPS protocol that are used by billions. So that's the kind of like an issue that you can build something very, very good, or you can build something very, very lousy.
Makes sense. So I couldn't stop thinking for a moment then what year I was in my university dorm room, and it wasn't 2016. I can tell you that. So you made reference earlier to the fact that, humbly saying like DeFi is not that big when you compare it to traditional finance, and you look at like the repo market that's handling trillions of dollars and this sort of thing. Do you have aspirations to take everything you're doing in DeFi into that world of sec lending, back into traditional finance and transform that, or you prefer to see it evolve within just a crypto ecosystem? How do you think about traditional finance in that sense?
Well, I think one of the interesting use cases is when we can actually take that value that is at the moment in the real economy and make it kind of like more movable and transformable on the blockchain ecosystem. And this will mean that effectively you could have exposure to any value that has the abilities to become tokenized. So I think real world assets is a very big use case. I will see that could come in the upcoming years. Stablecoins by itself, in one form, are real world assets. So basically, might be like USDC, where you have stablecoins issued against the cash balances that you have in the bank accounts. But I think like when you go even further, you could actually tokenize credit, receivables, properties, and obviously this is kind of like a market where we have a lot of value, but once you actually get it into the blockchain, you can make it programmable, and that's where smart contract-based protocols have a lot of utility. So I think like the down the line, the crypto use case will shrink to some extent, and then the bigger use case will come actually taking the value we have, getting it into the on-chain ecosystem, and also getting the liquidity from decentralized finance and financing real-world finance opportunities is another interesting use case too.
We were talking earlier how like the private markets, world of private assets, is so much bigger than like the public traditional finance capital markets, but it's been offline and everybody's digitizing it, taking it online. So you've got a DeFi world dealing with billions, you've got a public capital market doing trillions of dollars in sec lending and borrowing. But ultimately, if you apply DeFi to the private markets, you leapfrog and you end up with a potential universe that's even much bigger than the sec lending in public capital markets, I guess, right?
Yeah, and also you have like, I think what's more exciting is to find new opportunities to fund as well. So, and empowers, because like a lot of things in finance has been already invented and it works pretty well. You can optimize it to some extent. I could imagine that DeFi protocols and blockchain technology can actually have a lot of utility in the financial industry, where it's actually brings value. But I think the most fascinating part is to find kind of like the gaps where we don't have enough liquidity, or we could have new finance opportunities and find that kind of like an empowerment. And I think that's where like something like a blockchain where you have immutable data that you can use, and also the tokenization, you can find a lot of empowerment across the globe, which is something that I'm hoping will be the future.
Yeah, me too. So we're lucky to have Stani here. So I think we've got a couple of minutes for any questions that you might have. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah, I'm not running around with a hand mic. Let me do it, and then...
Thank you. Do you think neighbourhoods of verified counterparties is a first step towards regulating a space that is proving itself quite difficult to regulate?
Yeah, so the difficulty of, let's say, decentralized finance to regulate maybe is because of the nature of the permissionless technology. So like if you, some of these protocols, there isn't actually like a centralized counterparty. So, it might be a protocol that doesn't have any governance. Uniswap as a kind of like liquidity protocol has been working this way for a long time. But in some cases, you actually have a DAO behind of the protocol itself. So I think like it's not that really hard to regulate as a space, because you can always regulate like the Coinbases of the world, the fintechs that are using the tech itself. So I think like in one way, regulating the protocols, the infrastructure might be harder, and it will be more efficient to regulate actually those intermediaries that are using these markets. I think that could be the way. But I truly believe in self-regulation as well. So first and foremost, many of these protocols are run by the communities, and I think that's where a lot of value comes, because you can actually be as a community member, have a stake in the ecosystem, and be a decision maker how like finance as a public good could actually be evolved in the future. And regulation usually comes into place, this is me putting my lawyer hat on, when actually you see failures in the ecosystem where you have a lot of kind of like failures, like where you can't self-regulate the space, and then you have to have someone to come in and effectively set some rules as well. So, but I think it's the centralized parties that are accessing could be the best place to regulate.
Very good. I can see somebody else with a hand up. Todd?
Yeah, thanks for your time, Stani. You mentioned what's exciting to me is bringing real-world assets to decentralized finance, and you leaned in a little bit to that. I'd like to get your thoughts on what Maker's been doing in terms of, because they've been out front of kind of real-world assets. They've had a little bit of shake-ups and whatnot, but if you could look forward in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, do you think there's going to be 3, 4, 5, 10 people financing real-world assets?
I hope so. I think also Centrifuge is doing some interesting work in tokenizing credit and credit receivables, and I think that's an interesting form of tokenization, because you don't have that much of volatility in, let's say, US dollar nominated credit. Obviously, you have the credit risk as well there. But I think like tokenizing of credit and receivables might be something that comes sooner. But down the line, I could see more use cases in more of like private capital, things that are things that have less maybe restrictions and more utility in terms of tokenization.
I had another question at the back. I think we do one question where we're at. They don't want wine. They want to sit here listening to no. No, it's fine. Very quickly, go on with a short answer maybe, or we'll finish it over wine. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, Darren here. Just to add on to your question earlier about real assets and centrifuge. I understand you guys did work with centrifuge on real assets markets to create pools for basically loans to real assets. I was wondering how that was going, and to add on to the previous question, also MakerDAO, I think they have created vaults for quite a few of their loan products, but it seems like liquidity is not really there yet. It doesn't really get filled up. So maybe your thoughts on working with real assets currently with centrifuge, and then also what do you think that the industry needs to kind of increase platforms like yourselves to basically give out loans to securities or tokenized securities?
Yeah, there's a separate Aave market deployed together with the centrifuge community, where you can borrow liquidity against the real world assets that are created by centrifuge, mostly credit and receivables. And I think to get more liquidity, what you really need is to somehow to pile up these assets a bit more further down the line and kind of like mitigate risks. And maybe making it a bit more attractive, like an attractive option to stablecoins. So, for example, like when you don't want to have stablecoin exposure, you might want to jump out of stablecoins. Euro and like even like if you think about fiat currencies, euro and pounds are pretty much like plummeting at the moment. So you want to jump somewhere out of those exposures, and you can jump into US dollar, and even if that loses value, you want to go something else, and that's where things like real estate might come into place. So like there's probably a way of creating real world assets that have like a more kind of like a long-term value proposition of store of value that could be interesting for many of the DeFi users. I think that might be the way, and just like creating different kinds of like combined products, so you don't have to always like hold one particular asset, but you can have multiple at the same time in a basket.
I think that is a good place to stop, because when you talk about DeFi in the world of real assets, you're dealing with one of the most powerful tools in the largest market in the planet. So we're going to keep Stani for a bit of wine at the back, right, Mike? Cloudy Bay Chardonnay.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, this is like an extremely dedicated audience, because they started serving decent quality wine about half an hour ago. So
you permitted that to happen?
Yeah, well, I don't think I could stop it, right? So thank you very much, Anthony, for this afternoon, and thanks a lot, Stani. And
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stani. It's great.
Thanks
Mike.
for the audience for staying.